Hello there. This is Loren Schoenberg, and I'm really happy to be sharing this 1982 interview that I did with the tenor saxophonist Bud Freeman. It's certainly not in hi-fi. It was done over the telephone in a rudimentary fashion from my apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Bud was in Chicago at the time. I aired some of it on WKCR back in those days, but this is the whole thing unedited. It's hard to think of a great tenor saxophonist who was as well known in his time and as little known today as Bud Freeman. At the same time that Lester Young and Coleman Hawkins were figuring out their attitudes towards improvisation and influencing people, so was Bud Freeman. He sounded like no one else, and although he didn't exert the kind of influence on the jazz universe that Young and Hawkins did, he was just as original and just as respected for being that original at the time. Truly an amazing musician. He was born in Chicago, right near Chicago, in 1906, and he died in Chicago in 1991. When he grew up with his peers, Benny Goodman, Dave Tuff, Jimmy McPartland, also in Chicago at that time, were Big Sid Catlett and Lionel Hampton. They're all in the same general generation. And Bud Freeman really became well known by playing in Tommy Dorsey's band in the mid-1930s, making a lot of classic records. Then he moved over to the Benny Goodman band for a short time. And in both those bands, he played with a very close friend of his and musical brother, the drummer Dave Tuff. And before we actually get to the interview, we'll listen to Dave Tuff and Bud Freeman and another musical brother of theirs, who was also a great original, the clarinetist Pee Wee Russell. The early highlight of Bud Freeman's career was in 1939 and 1940 when he organized a band with a four-horn front line, trumpet, valve trombone, clarinet, and tenor, with arrangements by the brilliant Brad Gowans, who was the valve trombonist. And this band integrated written parts and improvised parts in a way that was right up there with the way that Ellington did it, later on the way that Jerry Mulligan did it. They would play what was written, they would improvise, you couldn't tell which was which, and it was just one of the great bands of all time. And I strongly recommend that you check out those records. Bud Freeman was also an in-demand jazz studio session guy back in those days, and in the 1930s, you can hear him with Lee Wiley, Billie Holiday, Mildred Bailey, Jelly Roll Morton, Artie Shaw, Lionel Hampton, Teddy Wilson, just to name a few. He was all over the place. In the 1940s and 50s, he remained very curious. He studied with Lenny Tristano, expanded his repertoire, and eventually was either leading his own bands or appearing with George Wein and his groups or Ruby Braff. In the 1960s, made some wonderful records, including some duets with guitars in the early 1960s with Carl Kress, among others, and was a mainstay in his kind of music. Before we go to the interview, let's hear Bud Freeman with pretty much his summa cum laude band, except that Brad Gowan sat out on this session and Jack Teagarden sat in. And it finds Bud Freeman with his close musical buddies Dave Tuff and Pee Wee Russell and Jack Teagarden, making music like no one ever did before and like no one has ever done since. Wasn't that something? At the Jazz Band Ball, recorded on July 24th, 1940. And because, as we mentioned before, Jack Teagarden was sitting in with the band, it wasn't quite the Summa Cum Laude Orchestra. It was issued as Bud Freeman and his famous Chicagoans. Max Kaminsky on the trumpet, Teagarden, trombone, Pee Wee Russell on the clarinet, Bud Freeman, of course, on the tenor, Dave Bowman, piano, Eddie Condon, guitar, Mort Stolmaker on the bass, and Dave Tuff on the drums. And that was at the Jazz Band Ball. Well, now it's time to go to the interview, again recorded in 1982, Bud Freeman.
I guess the first natural question, just to set these things straight, is to say you were born in Chicago.
Yes.
And were obviously raised in that town.
In Austin.
So you are an actual member of the Austin High gang.
Yes.
And you did go to Austin High. What other Chicago musicians actually did attend the Austin High School?
Well, the McPartland brothers, I met them there. Jimmy, the cornet player, and his brother Dick, the guitarist. And then Jim Lanigan, our bass player, had gone to Austin before us. He was several years older than us. And he ended up playing in the Chicago Symphony.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it was the Austin High gang. Actually, Dave Tuff went to Oak Park High School, you know, the great drummer. And his he had a girlfriend at Austin, and he used to come over every Friday. They would have in the social room a sort of jazz session, because the unique thing about Austin High was that it had several professional musicians. Before we came on, before we started to play, there were professional musicians attending Austin High.
Mm-hmm.
Not musicians who had anything to do with the high school band, but were professional saxophone players, pianists, trumpet players, clarinet players, whatnot. So I used to go to the social, it was a dance after 3 o'clock every Friday, and hear these guys play. And Dave Tuff came over. Dave was about, I think I was 15, Dave was 16. And he used to come over and to see his girlfriend, and I'd already heard of him. He had been playing professionally a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, he was always an idol, and he became a very dear friend. So we would include Dave as one of the Austin High gang. Then there was Teschmacher, who was killed in an automobile accident. I think he was about 20... maybe 26, 28 years old, I'm not sure, but he would have become one of the famous creative jazz players
of course,
in the world if he'd lived, because he had the talent. And he did make that record that we made with Conan and McKenzie, Chicagoans.
That's right.
Yeah, you know that record. Well, that was yes, that's right. Nobody's Sweetheart and those things was recorded in 27. That was our first date.
Right. There's also a famous picture in some jazz history books of a place, I don't know if it's the Midway Gardens.
Well, there was a Midway Garden marker. The clarinet player played with Muggsy. It wasn't Muggsy's band.
I see. But there's a picture of you with the McPartland brothers and Dave Tuff and Jim Lanigan.
The White City Ball was there that the band started to get a name, and Bix came to hear it, and Pee Wee, and a lot of the guys. See, the Go-Cat band had a job at Hudson Lake in those days.
Mm-hmm.
It was a summer job, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just before the band broke up. Frank Trombar headed the band, and in it were Bix and Pee Wee. Pee Wee, incidentally, played tenor and clarinet. A lot of people don't know that Pee Wee was a fine musician, that he was, they just think of him as being a kind of nervous clarinet player, but to me he was a very creative musician. And I remember sitting in on his tenor, and instead of having springs, he had rubber bands, keys in place. I couldn't get a note out of the tenor, but Pee Wee could make it work. But I did make an album. John Hammond and Eddie Condon asked me to play the clarinet on it, and there was a thing called Bud Freeman and the Windy City Five, and I had Bunny Berrigan on that.
That was with Tilly's Downtown Now.
That's right.
And the Buzzard.
In fact, I just got a call from... I think it was CBS. I think they're putting out that album again.
Oh.
And they wanted to know who the publishers were of my two original tunes.
Mm-hmm.
But it's having to do with actually a Bunny Berrigan story.
Mm-hmm. We will be playing that during our future show on you. I taped them off the Parlophone 78s.
Yes, you know that came out. That was not made for the United States. It was made for English Decca, which was Parlophone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then many years later, it was put into a thing called Gems of Jazz and put out in the States.
In these years when you were forming these early bands and playing various jobs around Chicago with the McFarland Brothers and Teschmacher and all your musical compatriots, I'm wondering, did you have the chance to see King Oliver and Louis Armstrong when they were appearing in Chicago?
That was long before I became a player. When I was 17 years old, Dave Tuff took me out to hear King Oliver and Louis. Now, before that, before hearing King Oliver and Louis at the Lincoln Gardens, the famous black nightclub in the impoverished black section of Chicago, we were very much into listening to the New Orleans Rhythm Kings because they played a different style, a newer style than the old-fashioned American dance music, of our time. But once we heard King Oliver and Louis, we never went back to the New Orleans Rhythm Kings.
Of course.
Because they were synthetic compared to King Oliver and Louis.
Sure. How would you...
So I feel that the greatest music lessons I've had in my, before I learned how to play, were in listening to that King Oliver band.
Yeah. How could you describe the ambience and the kind of atmosphere at the... was it the Lincoln Gardens? The Lincoln Gardens, yes. Yeah. Was it a mostly black clientele,
yes,
and you were kind
black, and some years later, when I made a television show with Lil Armstrong, a thing called Chicago and All That Jazz, she said to me at lunch one day, she said, we used to look out and see you white boys out there so well-dressed and wonder what you were staring at, because she didn't know they were making musical history, And I just told her that we were just so thrilled with hearing this new sound, and I told her what a great influence all of that was on our playing.
How would you characterize the difference?
Place? You mean the club?
Well, that's one question. I was also going to ask you, in addition, how would you characterize the difference between what you remember hearing in person and what we can hear on those records of the Creole Jazz Band?
Well, of course, it's too bad, really, about recordings, because you never really hear the thing as it was. I mean, there's so much that went into the music. For instance, the dancing of the people. The people seemed to swing the band, and the band in turn swung the people. It was such a beautiful thing to see. And here were these completely impoverished people who were not allowed any of the privileges of the white man. They had to stay pretty much in their own part of town, and yet they seemed to be much more relaxed and seemed to be having a much better time than any of we whites,
Sure.
So we loved all of that. It wasn't just the music; it was a way of life that we seem to understand so much and get such a kick out. They treated us beautifully.
Yeah.
And there was a big fat black doorman, weighed about 400 pounds, and he'd see us. He got to knowing us because we'd go out there 2 or 3 nights a week, and he'd say, "I see you're all out here to get your music lessons," which was sort of a sage thing for him to say, because but he knew that we loved the music and we weren't there for anything else.
At this point, you weren't playing, however.
I hadn't begun to play professionally. I didn't start to play professionally until I was 18.
I see.
But my dad bought me a C melody saxophone at the age of 16, and I didn't really study until I got a tenor, and I didn't get the tenor until I was 19.
Had you had a chance to hear the Benson's orchestra records with Frankie Trumbauer?
Yes, I heard all of the things he made, and of course we were very much influenced by Trumbauer. I think you'll find that Benny Carter, if you could pin him down, would say that he was very much influenced by Trumbauer, and I think Hawkins might have been too. But and I think I was, but as I say, my strongest influence was actually Louis Armstrong and of course all the great black pianists of that day, such as the Lucky Roberts, Willie the Lion Smith, Fats Waller, Earl Hines, James P. Johnson. And I was also very, very strongly influenced by black dancers, tap dancers. And, of course, Dave Tuff was a powerful influence on me. But I'd say that my strongest influence, even to this very day, would be and is Louis Armstrong.
Was there ever any sitting in on the part of your friends who were playing at the Lincoln Gardens?
Well, I don't recall that we ever sat in there because I would have been scared to death. But many, many years later, I remember sitting in with Earl Hines' band at the Grand Terrace. But then I'd already been playing for years,
I see. What I'd like to do now is just, you've already, of course, mentioned some of those names of your peers in those days, and I'd like to just throw their names out to you and get kind of just some off-the-cuff reflections on them.
Yes.
Of course, Frank Teschmacher is someone that is almost an enigma to people that didn't hear him because of the very small amount of recording he did.
Well, there again is the fault, of course, of the recording because, you didn't have the techniques in those days. We used to record into a megaphone, and people didn't really... people come to me today and they say, was he really all that good? Well, I can only say that he was... Had he lived, he would have become one of the great creative players. And people question me today about Pee Wee Russell because you had to see... Pee Wee Russell was a photogenic player. You had to see him really to enjoy him, to see how he suffered getting through a chorus, and yet there was something very creative in what he did, and I'm not too sure that came through on the recordings.
In the chain of influence, so you talk about yourself being influenced by Louis Armstrong, how does Teschmacher stand in relation to Pee Wee Russell and Benny Goodman and some of the other clarinet players who came out of Chicago? Was he a role model for them, or were they pretty much all contemporaries and influencing each other?
There's an interesting thing about this. Of course, Benny Goodman was sort of a genius. He was an accomplished clarinet player at the age of 12, and we idolized him. Of course, that was long when he was 12, I was 15, and that was long before I even knew I was going to play. But I would say that, creatively speaking, that Teschmacher had to be, although he was very strongly influenced by Jimmy Noon and Bix, perhaps more influenced by Bix. I feel certain that he along with Peavy, would have been one of the great creative players.
Is there any way that you could try and verbalize what he was doing in musical terms as opposed to Pee Wee? I mean, was he into the more eccentric sounds on the instrument that one could get like Pee Wee, or when you mentioned he was influenced by Jimmy Noon, was that he had a very smooth tone and a lot of technique, or?
Well, I wouldn't say that he had a smooth tone. It was a sort of rough tone because he was very young and he hadn't got into finding out about mouthpieces and good reeds yet, you see. But I heard him play, although he was playing with a very commercial band called Don Bester at the Aragon Ballroom. He was there primarily for his jazz, and he also played very good tenor. And a strange thing, I don't know if you'd ever be able to pin Artie Shaw down to admitting this, but Artie Shaw, whether he knew it or not, was very strongly influenced by Teschmacher, by what he had heard Teschmacher play on records.
I think in his autobiography he mentions playing with Teschmacher.
Oh, I see. I didn't know that he played with him. I see.
Yeah. Would I be correct in assuming that Bix Beiderbecke also had a tremendous influence on your friends and your peers?
He did. He was a god to us, you see. I think, you see, there, again, it's a pity about the records because the young people today who didn't know Bix cannot hear him through the players he played with. You see, Bix was very loyal to the guys in the Whiteman Band and the Gold Kid Band, but those were not essentially jazz musicians. They were dance band musicians, guys who could probably play in the symphony, who could read anything at sight. But I never thought of them as being real jazz musicians, but Bix made all those records with them because he was playing with them, and Bix, of course, was very happy to be with Gold Kid and to be with Whiteman. So I think there again, we don't really hear Bix as it was such a thrill to hear him in person, but I can hear him when I'm able to shut out all the other voices and hear Bix when I'm listening to Bix records today.
Would you be able to isolate some of the elements that made him so individual? Would his tone be one of them?
Bix's tone?
Yeah.
Yes, but you couldn't separate things. He was the perfect jazz musician. You know, to his musical high-mindedness, it was inconceivable to make a mistake. Not that there's anything wrong with making mistakes, because Louis Armstrong's mistakes were very beautiful, lustful, emotional things, without which we would have missed a great deal. But Bix was the perfect player, and I don't mean in any sense to compare them. And incidentally, Louis admired Bix very much. When Bix used to come to Chicago with Whiteman, or when he did come once at the Chicago Theater, Louis was there 3 or 4 times in a week to hear Bix.
In fact, one interesting thing is during that week, in the OK Record studios, one of the Bix and his gang sides took place directly after the Louis Armstrong Hot 5 session.
Yes.
They recorded back-to-back, and people have conjectured that that was one of the times when they got together and played, because there are a couple of stories that they played some very marvelous jam sessions and
oh, yes.
got to play together.
Yes. Well, I remember one thing in particular. You've heard of a place in Chicago called 222 North State, or rather the Three Deuces. Mm-hmm. The original name, the Three Deuces, the jazz club name, the original address of the place was 222 North State. Mm-hmm. That was a bar and grill across the street from the Chicago Theater. Now, this was in the year 1927, and Bix would go over between, during the intermissions, because I think they were playing about 4 or 5 shows a day in those days, and he'd go over there and go down to a sawdust-floored cellar where they had a broken-down piano, and Bix would sit there with it, perhaps have maybe a drink of gin or something, and just sit there and play. And so we heard about this, and we went down to hear our idol, and then guys came down, and one night they decided to have a big jam session, and in that session were the Dorsey brothers, Benny Goodman, Ben Pollock, Bix. I'm not sure the Trombar was there, and they called me up and asked me. Eddie Conning called and said, "Come down with your horn. Bix wants to hear you." And I went down, and it was a great thrill for me. And the place, incidentally, was sold out. I had to fight my way through the crowd. And there was no such thing as a jazz nightclub yet, other than the black places, and you wouldn't call them jazz nightclubs. They were cabarets that catered to black people.
You did get the chance to record with him later on when you came to New York.
Yes, I made all those those Victor sides with Hoagie,
right,
and with Bix.
How would you contrast what he was playing when you made those sessions with him, which were pretty much about a year before he passed?
Yes.
To what you remember hearing him play at these sessions in Chicago? Was there a...
Well, of course, the first time I heard Bix play, that lovely, natural, raw sound, it's just the most thrilling thing in the world. But I didn't know anything about music, and I was to learn later on as Bix went on and developed. Mm-hmm. I was to find that I preferred his playing later on. And when, incidentally, about a year before Bix died, we were rehearsing a band, an all-star band. Here were the personnel: Bix on cornet, the Dorsey brothers, Adrian Ruliti on bass saxophone, Dick McDonough guitar, Joe Sullivan piano, Gene Krupa drums, and myself tenor. And we were going to do 10 weeks of Europe. It would have been a first of its kind. Back in those days, we were already known in Europe. An incredible thing when you think that nobody in the United States knew who we were, excepting Bix. They knew. Everybody knew who. All the people in Europe knew who we were because they followed jazz that closely. And it would have been again, to repeat, it would have been a 10-week jazz concert tour. Well, Bix, and we were rehearsing at the old Greystone, the old Roseland Ballroom in New York, and Bix became ill during the rehearsals. Mm-hmm. He went back to Davenport, where he died a year later. That would have been something, though. A direct answer to your question. I preferred Bix's playing at the end. He had developed into the perfect artist. If you listen to the sound that Bix got on With Pleasure and any of those last Victor record things, but he wasn't well physically. He was weak.
Yeah, and I feel also that the rhythm sections that he was recording with had something to do with it too, because he finally did get to record with people like Krupa and Joe Sullivan instead of those rhythm sections out of the Paul Whiteman band or. Yes.
Well, I don't say, I say this with all due respect. These men were wonderful musicians, but I just didn't think that they were, they weren't jazz musicians. I mean, they didn't live that music as did Bix. And incidentally, all the great players were people who lived the music. A wonderful old line. I just picked. A friend sent me a book called the Ferguson Reader. Are you familiar with it?
The what reader?
The Otis Ferguson Reader.
Yes, of course.
Well, Otis was a dear friend of mine.
Oh.
And he was a merchant seaman. And in the 30s, around 1938, 39, I used to see him quite a lot in the village, and we used to talk a lot. And I remember one night somebody coming up and asking him something about jazz. He said, look, if you want to know anything about jazz, go to a jazz musician. Critics don't know. They can't know. They never lived the music.
That's right.
I'll never forget that, because that's that's not bad advice, especially today.
People like Frank Teschmacher and Bix Beiderbecke, Dave Tuff, Pee Wee Russell, yourself really were of a breed, it seems, that lived the music and were of an individual nature, and it all came out in the music, and I think that's a very large part of why the music is still timeless today, because it's really a reflection of individuals.
Yes, I don't mean to say this in any egomaniacal sense, but I think that had we not been, you see, if it hadn't been for jazz music, we wouldn't have been any kind of musician, because we were just we knew that we were listening to something new, a new sound in music, and we wanted to be a part of it. Now, although we were very strongly influenced, as I've said, by the King Oliver Band, we were only playing our impression of what we heard. We were not copying them, because in fact we sounded nothing like them, as you would agree. But interestingly enough, in an esoteric sense to speak, that record was known by every artist around the world. Anybody interested in new sounds in jazz had to know about that record.
The Chicago records that you made with these people do have a totally distinct character, and the ensemble style seems to be much more different.
Yes, of course. Well, of course, it was the first jam session ever recorded. Those weren't arrangements; those were jam sessions, and yet they were clean because we'd played a lot together.
Sure, the cohesiveness comes right through. Another name I'd like to throw out for discussion is, of course, someone who we know is very, very close and important to you, and you followed each other through a whole series of bands. Of course, that's the drummer Dave Tuff.
Yes.
And I'd just like to ask you your impressions, your reflections now over almost 40 years since he's passed away, and just about the nature of your relationship musically with him.
Yes, well, first of all, to go to the music, I think you see, as you know, we all hear differently. We all have different opinions. But to me, Dave Tuff was the greatest drummer I'd ever played with, and I played with all of them. All the avant-garde drummers of today, the black way-out drummers, were all strongly influenced by Dave Tuff. I'll never forget running into Max Roach on a very cold day in Chicago some 20 years ago. And the wind was really blowing up, on Michigan Avenue, and we ducked in somewhere because we wanted to talk, and all we talked about was Dave Tuff. And Max Roach told me how much he and all of his friends, black drummers, were influenced by Dave Tuff. Mm-hmm. Now, when you think that Dave Tuff was playing that way some 60 years ago, is there really anything new? For instance, a lot of the things that Dave Tuff was being satirical about, many of the drummers took seriously. Mm-hmm. For instance, the 3 against 4. Mm-hmm. You see, the 4 to the bar against a waltz beat.
Yep.
Dave was doing that, and we were breaking us all up, but just having fun.
Sure.
And that became a serious art form, it seemed.
Yeah.
But to get to Dave's influences in many other ways, I started to say that if we had not been jazz musicians, we would have been, I hope, some kind of artists, poets or painters or sculptors or writers, and in fact, Dave Tuff was becoming a writer just before he died, and had he lived, would have been a brilliant writer, because he was about the best red guy I'd ever met. And it was through Dave that I learned about books, about the theater, about cinema, that is, of the foreign films, about art. I'll never forget, I was 15 years old, Dave was 16. He called me one afternoon and he said, Bud, the Chicago Art Institute has bought all of Cézanne from the Louvre, and I confessed not having heard about Cézanne. I wasn't into painting yet. So we went over and I saw this first thing of Cézanne's, the fruit on the table, and I said to Dave, I wish I could say something about this magnificent painting. And Dave said, that's the best thing you'll ever say about it. Because he always thought that you either feel something or you don't, and words can get in the way of what you feel about a thing. He said, does it do anything to you? Does it move you? Things like this. So I owe very much, very, very much to Dave. He was a powerful influence on me. Certainly musically and every other way.
Yeah. It's always a pleasure to hear those records of you and Dave with the Tommy Dorsey Band and then with the Benny Goodman Band.
That was a great thing. Now, bear in mind, when I said earlier, I hope I don't sound egomaniacal, but that phrase, on Stop, Look, and Listen had never been played by anybody before in jazz or any other kind of music. That it's difficult to sing it, but that became an international phrase. I think it takes place in the second chorus, improvised chorus of mine in Stop, Look, and Listen. Do you know it?
Of course I do.
Yes. All right. So that became an international phrase, and I'll never forget, Smith had a little band, and he played that as an arrangement. Just the phrase he had made out of it. It was every time I'd come in to hear him play somewhere, he played that. And then about 15 years ago, maybe less, in London, Eddie Miller, the tenor man, Lockjaw Davis, the tenor man, Ben Webster, and I made an album called Just for Tenor, and Ben took that phrase and made an arrangement of it, and he called it Bud.
Really?
I was so flattered by the whole thing, and and then of course you remember the chorus with the anticipated beat, like bum bum doo la doo. Do you remember that thing? Now Lester Young told me that he actually took that from the record, and he made, of course, Lester Young was the talk of the world, because he came along where all the guys were getting the big Hawkins-like sound, and he had this little cool sound, and he just took over the world of tenor players. But he told me that he took that from the record and recorded it himself, and I don't remember the tune he did it on, but everybody said, well, gee, isn't that Lester Young, isn't that a wonderful thing? Now, of course, I loved Lester Young. I thought he had the best taste of any jazz tenor player I'd ever heard.
Yeah.
But Lester started to play about 8 years after us.
Yes, he did. He was playing all through the 20s with a family band, and he certainly many times talks about the influence Frankie Trumbauer had on him.
That's right. He did. He was very, not strongly influenced by Trumbauer, but he was certainly influenced by him.
And, of course, you could really say that there were three tenor players in the 1930s who were individuals. And, of course, I would say it would be yourself, Coleman Hawkins, and when Prez came along in the late 30s, pretty much everyone else can be traced directly back to someone else.
Yes.
And that was a question that I want to hold.
Well, it's very nice to hear that, but the thing is, I thought, this is a strange thing to say, but although I preferred Lester Young's playing, I thought Hawkins was about the best musician of any tenor player. I'm speaking of Hawkins as a fine musician. He had a degree in music, and he also played cello and piano. But if we're speaking strictly of jazz, then Lester Young would have to be my man. But the best ballad player I ever heard was Ben Webster. And, of course, Eddie Miller had, in a way, the best sound I've ever heard on the tenor. Eddie Miller,
yes, from
you're playing.
Right.
I mean, that lovely, beautiful sound.
I'd like to ask you more questions about these tenor players. Could you tell me about the first time you remember hearing Coleman Hawkins in person?
Yes, the first time I heard him, I was 19 years old. I was playing, you see the band that played at the White City that you asked about, took the name of the Wolverines.
Yep.
Bix had left the Wolverines. Jimmy McParland went with him in Bix's place, and then a year later, the band folded up. Dick Voyno, I think, died, and that was the end of that. And so Jimmy took this band that he fronted of ours, and we called it the Wolverines, and we went to Detroit to play in the Greystone Ballroom, and we were alternating with the great Fletcher Henderson Band, and that was the first time I heard Hawkins. Now, although I don't think that musically I was influenced by Hawkins, but I was influenced by one thing that, you see, the tenor, as I played it, was sort of an accompanimental instrument. I had not played it yet as a solo instrument, really, because this was before I made, Nobody's Sweetheart and those things on OK. And so I would weave in and out. Instead of having the trombone in our band, we'd have clarinet and cornet, and I would weave in and out without getting in the way of the cornet lead or the clarinet second part. So that became sort of a Chicago-style way of playing tenor, I suppose. I hate this idea of Chicago style, but people insist upon giving these things categories. Anyway, when I heard Hawkins play, I was amazed at the powerful authority he had on the tenor. I had never heard anybody before or since play with such powerful authority as a soloist. So that influenced me into becoming a soloist myself.
Supposedly he was really turned around, as you were, by Louis Armstrong when they were in the Fletcher Henderson band together.
Yes.
That's one inspiration that you both share. Getting to Lester Young, I've seen a lovely picture, I don't know if you've seen it, of you and Prez talking at the famous door.
No, I've never seen that.
Yes, you're sitting at a table in the summer of '38, and there's you and Lester Young and I think Harry Lim. And in fact, it's on the back cover of one of Harry Lim's records.
I'll be damned, I've never seen that.
It's a lovely picture, and I can't tell you, how much your playing means to me and how much his does, and to see you two together at that time. It's a shame you didn't have a chance to record together. Did you?
Oh, I would have loved that.
Did you get to play with each other back in the 30s?
I don't recall ever having played with Lester. When I was with Benny Goodman in '38, Lester was still with the Count Basie, and the two bands were on the same bandstand, back to back, and. Of course, I loved Lester's playing because I thought he had, as I said earlier, the best taste and certainly was the most creative tenor player of his time. And, of course, thus all the followers, and you hear them today, but they're so synthetic compared to the real thing,
Of course. Another tenor player in the 1930s who I don't find that far removed from some of your conceptions, and of course you were on the map way before he had the chance to play, was a tenor man who played with Andy Kirk Band, and that was Dick Wilson.
Oh, Dick, I knew Dick.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you have any memories of him or meeting him?
Not really, because they used to play now and then at the, they played up in Harlem, and they used to play now and then at the Rosen Ballroom downtown, but I was traveling a lot in those days, and I didn't really get a chance to hear him. In the earlier days, when I wasn't doing anything, I used to practically live in Harlem,
Mm-hmm.
Go up to hear the great pianists and dance and watch the dancers and all that.
Let me throw out a couple of other names. Chu Berry, Herschel Evans.
Oh, Chu Berry was a very dear friend. I used to hang out with him, and I thought if he had lived, he would have become a giant. In fact, many people thought he was.
You even made a record session with him with Billie Holiday.
Isn't that odd? People tell me that, and I don't seem to remember it.
Yeah. Actually, I'll tell you, I'm not even sure you're wrong. I went and listened to the records, and the only tenor, there's a 4-bar tenor solo by Chu on the 4 titles, and that's it. But they put you in on the session. It was done while you were with Benny Goodman.
I'll be damned. I don't recall the session at all. But there were so many. You must realize we were recording 3 and 4 days a week in those days,
Did you ever have a chance to play with Herschel Evans?
I never played with Herschel, but he was a good friend. I used to see him quite a lot, when we I'd run into him on the road. I was playing with Benny then, and he was with Basie, of course. I thought Herschel was a very talented player, but then, of course, it was unfortunate for him. Lester Young was in the band, and in my view, Lester Young was the creative player in the band.
I'd like to backtrack a little bit to the late 20s and the early 30s and ask you when you first left Chicago for the first time and when you came to New York.
I left Chicago for the first time to go with Ben Pollock in 1928, and it was on the strength of that record I made with Connie McKenzie's that I got the job. And of course, Benny Goodman was a good friend, and Jimmy McParland, Glenn Miller, they were all helpful in getting me into the band, and that was the first, I'd say, big, well-known band I'd played with. Although it was only 10 men, it was really a fine band.
Yeah. There's some stories of Teschmacher subbing in the band briefly when you were there with Benny Goodman, and, and that you three were together. I think
Bill Roden was out.
Right.
He'd had a tonsillitis operation, I think, and he was out for a couple of weeks. And Tesh came in. We were doing some one-nighters. We also played the big steel pier on Atlantic City, and Tesh came in to substitute for about a week or two. Well, it was a lot of fun, yeah.
So you left Chicago in 1928 to go with Ben Pollock. When did you wind up in New York for good?
Well, I never could make up my mind. I left Pollock after about 6 or 7 months, and I went over to Europe just to see Dave Tuff. And then I was supposed to go with the band Dave was with, but it was kind of a corny band, and I was depressed at hearing it. But Dave loved the life in Europe, and he wanted to stay. So I came back, and I went directly to Chicago. And played with Zez Confrey, a very cornball piano player, although he was a brilliant musician and a fine composer and concert pianist practically. I was just hired for my jazz course, and he was very pleasant to me. And then I worked in a couple of the Capone places out here, and then I got a wire from the Dorsey brothers to come to New York to make some records and do some jobs around. And then from there, I went back to Chicago again, and I played with a band called Charlie Pierce. We played a ballroom here. And then I went back to New York in 1930. At the time, I recorded with... I'm a little mixed up here. I recorded with Hoagie. Do you remember were those
1930
or 30?
1930. But you also made some records in New York. Actually, I don't think there were any in New York in 29. I think they were 1930. The sessions with Red McKenzie, where supposedly you and Coleman Hawkins are together on one title.
Yes.
Arkansas
right,
Blues.
I had an original tune on that. Now, I never heard that record. I don't know what the hell ever happened. Glenn Miller was on that date, too, I remember. And
so that would be 1930.
All right, then I went back to Chicago once more. And then finally I left to join Mesro's band. And that didn't work out. You know, Mesro actually had the first black-white band long before John Hammond gave the idea to Benny Goodman. And then I stayed and I played with a few bands around, and then I joined. I went with. Let me see now. Roger Wolf Kahn.
Oh, you did?
I met DeMax Farley, and I joined Roger Wolf Kahn's band, and then I went from Roger Wolf Kahn to Joe Hames. I was with Joe Hames for 18 months, and then Ray Noble came over, and Toots Mondello and I, and Andy Ferretti, a wonderful trumpet player, left Joe Hames to join Ray Noble. No, not Andy Ferretti, I'm sorry. It was Pee Wee Irwin. Pee Wee Irwin, let's see now. Yeah, and we stayed with Noble for 18 months, and then I went with Whiteman. Carl Kress and I played in that little band with Frank Trombar and Roy Barge and people like that.
Was that the origin of the three T's?
Pardon?
The three T's, Teagarden and the two Teagarden brothers.
Jack Teagarden, in fact, got me in the thing. Jack and his brother Charlie.
I see.
And then that was short-lived, and then I went from there to Tommy Dorsey. I was with Tommy for 2 years, and then I went with Benny Goodman for a year.
Right.
Then I vowed never to work for anybody again, and I haven't, actually, because when I worked with the World's Greatest Jazz Band, that was a cooperative band, so I wasn't really working for anybody but myself. And then I and then after I left them in Europe about, oh Lord, it's almost 10 years ago now, I guess, and stayed in Europe all those years, and then was invited back to Chicago, where they gave me a tribute here a couple of years ago, and I decided to stay because I found a lovely apartment here in a lovely area, about a block from the lake, and although I don't do any work here really, I use it as a base. I still go back to Europe. I just got back from Europe about just 10 weeks ago, and I'd probably be going to Europe a couple of times a year, but I'm getting more into lecturing now. I did a lecture at Northwestern University, a jazz anecdotal thing, which they like. And I have an offer now. I might get a grant here to record a lot of anecdotes that I tell and that I've written in cassettes, with the view to getting them on the networks. And if that works out, that'll be an added thing. So I've sort of cut my playing down because I don't want to play with bands. I just turned on an offer to go with what was left of the World's Greatest Jazz Band recently, Bob Haggard and Yank Lawson. Because, as I say, I don't want to play with bands. I have a quintet out here that is the best thing I've ever played with. A brilliant pianist by the name of Stu Katz, beautiful bass player John Bainey, Barrett Deems, one of the great drummers around, and a fine guitarist by the name of Bobby Roberts. And we play occasionally at the old Blackstone in a lovely little room there. And then I do quite a few things in Canada. So this is what I prefer to do. I don't like playing in bands anymore.
Of course. If I can take you back, though, to ask you a couple of questions about some of the bands you played in, I'd like to contrast the two bands you spent parts of 1933 and 34 with Joe Hames, and then, of course, you were in that great band Ray Noble had up at the Rainbow Grill, the Rainbow Room, with Glenn Miller and all the top studio musicians. I was wondering how you would contrast the two bands in terms of your contribution and how much soloing you had to do.
Well, of course, I was in the band essentially for my solo work, you see. And so in all the bands, I had quite a lot of solo work to do.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Joe Hames band, there was a phrase I used to play on. I used to play about 12 choruses of the St. Louis blues, just the blues in G. And there was a phrase I started to play that later became an international phrase, and Jimmy Dorsey made a tune out of the phrase.
Mm-hmm.
It was a thing that it's difficult to sing, but it was da-do-dee-bee-bop-bop-beep-beep-boo.
Oh, sure.
You remember that?
Sure. And
that was a phrase of mine that became an international. I sound like an egomaniac.
No, you don't.
It's just that I'm interested in.
It's very funny you mentioned that
I've
phrase.
always been interested in composition, you see, taking a tune and making another tune out of it.
Yes, well, that's partially what I want to get into in a few moments when we talk about the eel and the buzzard and some of the very individual and unique conceptions with which we identify with you. That particular phrase, it's funny you mentioned it, because as I was going through this ton of records, I was working with Dan Morgenstern.
Yes.
He was helping me, and we heard that phrase. And we stopped the thing, and we realized that later became a tune by Duke Ellington called Stepping into Swing Society.
Yes, that's true, but I didn't want to say that.
And all through your work, it's amazing. There's some air checks. I assume you've heard them of yourself with the Benny Goodman Band. And tunes like that where, so Clap Hands, Here Come Charlie, you had a feature on, where you're doing things that really were 101% new and unique to jazz. There was really no precedent for some of the sounds, also the harmonics on the instrument, things you really pioneered. I'd like to get into that a little bit.
Well, I'll tell you what I feel about all this. You see, I've never really been interested in trying to be a sensational player. I've always been interested in composing on the horn, such as today I find myself more into ballads, what I would call a sort of a jazz ballad, not the syrupy, slow type of thing, but ballads where I can they're kind of medium tempo things. On the wonderful old Broadway show tunes, I've always loved those and always wanted to play them, and never had a chance to play them in a jazz band, nor in the big bands, because in the big bands you'd be playing an arrangement, you'd stand up and play 8 or 16 bars, and that was about all you could do until I got with Tommy, and of course he allowed me to do a lot of playing. Now in the Goodman band, I wasn't able to do anything, because after all, Benny Goodman was the feature and a magnificent, great genius of a clarinet player, so he wasn't about to let me play any 10 choruses,
But you did have the chance on some air checks of the band to stretch out. There's some versions that don't be that way, where at the end of the arrangement you come back in and play for quite a bit.
Oh, I never heard any of those. Incidentally, I was with all, I want to thank you for suggesting sending me those things, but I wouldn't know what to do with them. I don't have a
cassette machine,
a player or anything, and I move around so much that every time I move, I have to give all of this stuff away. I tell people not to send me things. I don't own any records of mine. When I'm invited to someone's home, they always ask if they can play some of my records, and I say, no, I'd like to hear some Bobby Hackett or Louis or Bix or Fats or The Lion or, because I learn that way,
Sure.
I can't learn anything listening to myself.
There's a difference in the conception. I really hear on those Dorsey records and on those Goodman records how you and Dave Tuff are working really hand in hand, and you really both seem to be on quite a different kick when you were in the Goodman band than you were in the Dorsey band. Not that your playing changed at all, but just the context you were in. The Dorsey band seemed to be a little more older-fashioned than some of the arrangements the Goodman band was playing.
Well, that point is well taken. We were, with all due respect to Benny Goodman, a great genius, Dave and I were terribly unhappy in the band. In the Dorsey band, there's an interesting thing to note. Tommy was not selling jazz. He had a very commercial, well, of course, Benny Goodman had a very commercial band, too, but Tommy was selling Tommy Dorsey's trombone, and he loved jazz music, and he loved any guys who could play, so he would feature us a great deal. But Benny was selling jazz, you see, and so he's not going to feature, wasn't going to feature us. I don't know, it was just a kind of, to me, it was a little more, it was a kind of a stiff band compared to playing with Tommy.
Really?
Well, I mean that Benny wanted that. We used to discuss that. Benny didn't want things to get loose.
Right.
He wanted that tight feeling, you see. So there was a feeling, a tremendous feeling of tension in Benny's band. Whereas in the Dorsey band, where we were not selling jazz, but just it was a labor of love sort of thing, we could relax more.
During the time that you were with the Dorsey band and the Goodman band, you were part of several radio broadcasts that have since become classic recordings, and of course have even sold as such. Two I can think of offhand, of course, is the famous session in '38 with Louis and Fats Waller, Teagarden.
Yes.
And then there's another one in the I think it was also 1938, where Alistair Cook
That's right.
emceed a broadcast to... The St. Regis?
Yes.
Yeah.
St. Regis.
Could you tell us anything about those two, the one with Louis and the one with Alistair Cook?
First of all, there was a guy by the name of Martin Block, had a famous radio show. He was a disc jockey, and he just got the idea to have us all come up and play, do a jam session. And so I had just won the Life magazine jazz poll and downbeat and all that, and Fats had won something, and Louis, of course, had won it every year, and I think George Watling was the drummer on that, and we went up and had this jam session, which was a very successful thing. They had a big audience for it, and I didn't know that they put an album out of that, for which I don't think we were paid. We were paid for the broadcast, but I don't think we were ever... I know we weren't paid for the album. And then, well, not that that's what we're talking about, but anyway, then the thing with Alistair Cook was at the St. Regis. That was Joe Marcello was a clarinet player who had a band at the Hickory House, and we used to go in there. He was a wonderful guy, and we'd go in and have jam sessions there. We always went in to sit in with Joe. And Joe met Alistair, and a guy, a producer from England by the name of Green, and they told him they wanted to broadcast all of these famous jazz soloists to England. Now, just think, there was no market for or interest for that sort of thing in America, but there it was. Everybody in England stayed up all night to hear that. They told me, I lived in London for over a period of 24 years.
There's a famous story going back to your English fans, that when Stanley Dance first came over,
yes,
he met up with you and Dave Tough,
yes,
and you both absolutely floored him with your kind of encyclopedic knowledge of writing and literature. That was kind of an early indication that you two were quite separate from the common stereotype of American jazz musicians.
In Dave's life and my life, there was a strong ambivalence, that of being something else other than a musician, you see. Because I remember when I went to see especially a British play, I came out so mixed up, wishing that I were that British actor uttering those Shakespearean lines, And then it would take some time to get my thinking back to playing. And I think that the more successful players were guys who were just one track, who thought only of playing and didn't care about words or... we were very much into the other art. So, as I say that we were ambivalent about just what to be. And Dave Tough had quit playing for a long time, and I quit playing many different times. And as I say, Dave would have become a fine writer if he'd lived.
What was the genesis of that record you made for Commodore called Private Jives?
Well, of course, there again, it was a love for words, and I could read scripts at sight. I didn't need to. I could read. I didn't need to rehearse, and so I gave that idea to Minerva Pius, who died not so long ago in Paris. She was a fine actress on the Fred Allen show. I think it was a thing called Allen's Alley. And so she told her husband about it, Bernie Hannigan, and they got a writer by the name of John DeVries, who's still around in New York, and he... we sat for about an hour and talked about the idea, and he wrote this satire on... Private Lives. And I was supposed to be Noel Card, and Minerva Pius was supposed to be Gertrude Loren.
We will be playing that during the show, by the way.
Well, the point is this, we couldn't play it all those years ago because it was too suggestive.
Yes.
But it would be mild today.
It's in very good taste. You mentioned a few moments ago that now you like to play ballads, which you called jazz ballads. Some of my favorite ballad work of yours, and some of the earliest things, were those dates you made with Lee Wiley from the Liberty Music Shop.
Yes, they were good. That was one of my favorite dates.
Yes, you played...
Fats was on that.
Yes.
I'll never forget that. Now, there again, that was DeVries and
Max Kaminsky.
Ernie Anderson selected those beautiful songs for Lee. And now, speaking of Lee Wiley, there was a woman who was not really in the commercial swim of things. She was a labor of love singer. You know, she was very successful in radio, but she never really followed it up. I mean, she didn't have the drive that a lot of singers have had, you know, to keep working. But I thought of her time that she was certainly the best I'd ever heard.
Would you at all be able to contrast your style with Mildred Bailey and Billie Holiday's?
Well, Billie Holiday and Mildred Bailey were two different styles. They were, I would say that, well, we all have our preferences. I preferred Lee Wiley. Mm-hmm. I thought Lee was the best of the three of them.
When you left the big bands, as you mentioned, you didn't want to work for anyone else again, and
yes.
Certainly had no need to. You formed the Summer Cum Laude band.
I didn't form the band. That was Eddie Condon's band. He had that band down at Nick's, and when I left Benny Goodman, there was a tremendous amount of publicity, and so Ernie Anderson, who now handles Charles Bronson's publicity, asked me if I would front the Condon band. He said I'd have no headaches other than just to play. And so it was a good thing, actually, for them, because I was able to get all these record dates. I knew everybody at Victor and Decca and all that. And as a result of my fronting Condon's band, we did and knowing all these people and recording, we did get a lot of record dates. Played at Nick's for about 7 months.
Right. Was that also part of that show, Swing in the Dream?
We left Nick's to go into Swing in the Dream, and then never went back to Nick's. Eddie went back, but I didn't.
You were associated, of course, with the Eddie Condon mob for many years. How do you see yourself and how you fit in with those people? Many people see you and Pee Wee as really being kind of more modern players and ones that we wish possibly could have had more of an opportunity to play outside of those circles. How does that strike you?
The thing is this, that Condon's music, first of all, I think that if you listen to the Condon records, you'll find that there's a lot of taste in them. I think they'll live a long time. I'm not talking particularly about the style, but I think that they were well made, well recorded, and he took pains, and he did do, I think, a lot for music. We played, you see, one couldn't make a living playing jazz music back in those days, so we played with Condon. It was a means of expressing what we felt about music as soloists. You could do that easier with Condon. I wasn't that closely associated with Eddie. I made some sides with him, the first of which, we mentioned earlier, the Nobody's Sweetheart and those things. But I didn't play with Eddie very much. You see, when Eddie had his club downtown, I used to take an all-star band in there on the off night. And then I would sit in once in a while. It was a place to sit in. And then when Eddie had the place uptown, I had a trio there. But actually, I don't know why people seem to think that I'm so closely associated with Eddie, because I didn't play with him that much.
Do you have any memories, by the way, of going back and playing with Benny Goodman in 1945, 46?
I just went back and did a record date with him.
I see.
That was all. Just one record date, and he didn't put it out.
A question of a personal nature. How did you find the difference in your relationships and the difference in the music between when you were playing with people like Benny and Tommy Dorsey, when you were all youngsters around Chicago and New York, and then later on when you got to play in their bands?
Well, it was unthinkable that one could ever make a living playing jazz as a soloist in those days. So we'd get together on jam sessions and record dates and all that. And, of course, I had great admiration for Benny. I thought he was about the best clarinet player in the world. I don't mean in a creative sense. I don't think he was a great creative player, but he was certainly the best clarinet player I'd ever played with. And, of course, it's later on when I was to work for them, work for Tommy and Benny, I had a different feeling about them. They were bosses, and
Sure.
That great respect I had for them as a kid changed, you see, because you're now in a competitive field, and it seems you're not a leader yourself, and there are many things about leaders you resent, and you don't realize that they're taking all the headaches, and they have a right perhaps to be the way they are, but you resent them, you see,
Sure.
and so my feelings toward them changed. Although I must say, musically too, I must say that Tommy, although Tommy was a tough guy, he was very good to me, and seemed to have a lot of respect for what I did.
Yes.
I think much more than Benny. Although I've read in the last 10 or 15 years, people have said that they read something that Benny Goodman said in a book that was very complimentary about my playing, so I was surprised about that, because Benny didn't seem to like my playing when I was playing with him. Well, I'm sure that he didn't.
He hired you.
Well, I know, but actually, John Hammond was the one who got me into the Goodman band.
I see. Maybe also the fact that Dave Tuff was there had something to do with it.
Well, I went there because Dave Tuff was in the band.
The Commodore trio sessions you made in early 1938.
Yes.
What was the genesis of that? Was that an idea of yours, and had you obviously hadn't worked?
Well, I knew Milt Gabler, who had been recording Dave Tuff, and Milt asked me if I'd like to record Jess Stacy and George Welling. And, of course, I'd had a lot of publicity at that time, and I was still with Benny, I think, when I made the first date, and then we
I think the first one was made before you went with him. The first date was
right, you're right.
The first date was January 17th, and
asking me about that.
That was the day after his Carnegie Hall concert, where Jess had broken it up.
That's right.
Have you had the chance to work in trio settings since then?
Yes, I did. They brought Jess out from California, and we did do a trio record. Well, part of the thing was a duet.
I believe the name of that was the Joyous Sax.
Oh, that's right.
The Joyous Sax.
Johnny DeVries, the guy who wrote Private Jives, did the cover.
I see. Bart is someone who really was an innovative artist, and really, to many minds, was really a very free player way back before there were many people who took the chances and played things as not far out as you did, but just took the chances. You seemed to be like a player who was always taking chances. How did you view the later developments in jazz with Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk, and later on Ornette Coleman and John Coltrane? You have anything to say about those developments?
Well, I certainly think that Parker was some sort of genius. I wasn't influenced by that kind of playing, but I had to have great respect for many of the great artists, and I thought the best player in that style of music was Bud Powell. I'll never forget when I heard him play, I said, this is what these guys are trying to do. Because he was so clean, and it was just so creative and so beautiful. I thought he was a marvelous player. I just heard him play one time, and of course I thought that Dizzy was a great talent. I still do think that. And Parker, I remember listening to about everything Parker made one night at a friend's house in Nuremberg, Germany, and I was amazed at the man's talent. But as I say, I was not influenced by that style of playing. I had a thing that I believed in, and I feel this, that thousands of people, or maybe hundreds of musicians, copied Charlie Parker, but never had anything to say for themselves. And I always believed in if I were going to play, that I had to be some kind of voice of my own, And so the guys that I respected were men who were saying something. The great Websters, the Hawkins, the Lester Youngs, they were all, they had their own voices.
What led you to be associated with Lenny Tristano for a while?
Well, I was just, actually, I just wanted to study, and I thought he had a lot of talent. I was only with him a short time because I was traveling a lot, and I don't think I spent more than a month with him, but I just, thought he was a very talented guy, and I wanted to study, but I didn't, I wasn't there long enough to get into anything.
Of course, you're famous for your compositions, the eel more than that, which is an interesting mixture of blues and different chord changes which you used during the tune. And I was wondering what the genesis was for that routine.
Well, actually, that was a phrase that I used to play, and which I made a tune out of. As you know, it begins with the B-flat 7th and then the D-flat 9th, and then after that we go into the E-flat blues. There's a modulation, several choruses, and then back into the thing. Do you know that to this very day, the eel is... I still get requests for the eel, but I don't play it, because if you don't play it all the time, it's a little difficult to play. And there aren't any of the young players who know the eel, And there's an interesting thing to note about that. I got an award from them. I'm an ASCAP member, and I got an award from them on the eel. They voted it some sort of jazz classic.
Well, it certainly is, and yourself view the development in your playing. Obviously, those records you made in 27 and 28 were at a very early stage of your career. But by the time you get to those New York sessions in 33, the dates with Joe Venuti and his Blue Six is a favorite of mine, with doing the new Low Down and In the Rough and all those things, and then into the sessions you made under your own name in the 30s. How do you see now, in retrospect, your stylistic development?
Well, it's very easy to say, but I prefer my playing today because I feel, you see, in having become a soloist, having begun, say, in 1939 to become strictly a soloist, I have learned so much more about music and certainly much more about my playing, and I like to feel that I'm playing better, certainly more creatively, and getting more into composing and getting a better sound, and of course I know the instrument better, and it's I don't care for my early playing at all.
Do you still play a con?
Pardon?
You play a con?
I play an old con saxophone, yeah.
A 10M?
I guess so, yeah. I bought this from Eddie Miller. I was playing a concert with the world's greatest jazz band out some Idaho one Sunday afternoon, and the right side of the horn fell off.
Oh,
and there I was. They ran out and got an old Martin for me that I could hardly play, but as it turned out, a very dear friend of Eddie Miller. Eddie Miller was living in New Orleans and playing with Pete Fountain, and Nappy Lamar was in our band at the time, and he called Eddie and told him I needed a horn, and Eddie sent me this horn. I think it must be over 50 years old, and I bought it from him. Been using it ever since. It's a good old horn.
Have you ever played anything other than a rubber mouthpiece?
Well, I might have. I think I made one recording with Tommy Dorsey where I used a metal mouthpiece, and I can't think of the name of the tune now. It was Codfish Ball.
Oh, yes.
I used a Link. Auto Link made that mouthpiece for me.
Did you?
But I never liked the metal mouthpieces. I've been using a Brillhart since, 39, I guess. No, I'm sorry. I did use a rubber Link up until, no, I didn't start using the Brillharts until after the war.
Do you ever have any thoughts of picking up the clarinet again?
Oh, no. I never took myself seriously. You see, in those days, playing in the big bands, we had to double, and so the double was clarinet, and you play the second clarinet parts. And but I never, after sitting next to people like the great Benny Goodman and all the wonderful clarinet players I'd known, I couldn't take myself seriously as a clarinet player, but some people seem to think I could play, some creative things on jazz, so...
Are there any up-and-coming jazz musicians who you see as favorites and who you look forward to hearing more from?
Well, of course, I wouldn't call Bob Wilbur an up-and-coming player, but he's developed into a masterful player. I like Scott Hamilton very much. I don't know... I heard a wonderful young guitarist in Ottawa not so long ago. I'm that way about names. He's a super player. I played with him there at the Chateau Laurier, which has a wonderful jazz room. There are, of course, everybody's younger than I. So, people like, oh dear.
Do you have any plans to record in the near future?
Well, I'm hoping to record. I'm looking for a sponsor to record this Chicago quintet, which I think is the best group, as I said earlier, that I've ever had. And we play, we play a jazz showcase here in Chicago once in a while, just to keep the thing together. And I've done some concerts with it, and I just love it. It has a wonderful sound, and it's very creative. And the pianist now is out of the Charlie Parker School, but he's the best player of that style I've ever heard outside of Bud Powell. And they all play that way, but they're magnificent players. They have a great deal of musicality in their playing, as opposed to many of the people who do playing that style who do not have musicality.
What kind of repertoire do you do with this band? Is it mostly the tunes that you've been associated with?
I don't do any jazz band tunes at all. I do tunes like if I could write a book and what is there to say? All these great tunes, all the Gershwin things. The Man I Love is still one of my great favorites. All the Cole Porter things. All the Jerome Kern things. And we have quite a repertoire in the group. We've got a lot of originals.
Of course. I look forward to hearing it. The most recent recording of yours I've heard is the session you did last year with Ruby Braff, Kenny DeVerne, Ralph Sutton.
That was that was a concert I played at Minnetonka Golf Club, just outside of Minneapolis. And that was just taken from one set. I think I've got 2 or 3 numbers on there.
That's a very enjoyable session. I thought it came out.
I didn't hear it.
It's on that Chaz record label. But is there any chance of us seeing you in New York?
Well, I got a call from Bob Thiel, who's been a very dear friend, and I made an album for Bob that he seemed to like some years ago. I was living in London, and he brought me back, and I made the album, and it got an Album of the Month award, and we were very pleased with it. That was the thing I did with Bucky Pizzarella, the brilliant guitar player. And I talked Bob wanted me to do something with his lovely wife in Atlantic City a few nights, but I wasn't available. I was going back to Europe, and talked about the idea of possibly of doing a record session. He has a new label.
Yes, he does.
But I wouldn't want to ask him.
Well, all I can say is that you're very sorely missed here in New York.
Thank you very much.
I look forward to being able to meet you and hear you in person. Actually, I did hear you once when I was younger on the Staten Island Ferry.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
that was a lot of fun. That was with George Wein, I think.
Yeah, I think it was with Earl Hines. It was like a jam session in 1972. On the,
well, let's see, 72. That would have been with the
World's Greatest
Jazz Band.
Right. Yeah.
George Wein booked us on that.
I see. Well, but I'd like to thank you very much for taking over an hour of your time.
Well, it's a pleasure. And as regards my coming to New York, I would certainly go there if there were a record session. So maybe I'll see you there when if I do one. Well,
I certainly hope so. And I want you to know we'll be enjoying your sounds for 6 hours.
Well, thank you. Is there any way you could send me a copy of this thing that we've done today?
Of course.
I would appreciate that. That's all I'd want, because I can use these things. I take notes on them.
Sure.
Because I'll be making, as I told you, these cassettes of anecdotes.
I'd be more than happy to. I have your address. John McDonough gave it to me. And
great.
Everyone in New York sends their regards, including Sammy Margolis and Dick Sutholter.
There's a fine player.
Yeah. Well, in fact, he's going to come up during part of the show, and he's going to talk about the tremendous influence you had on him.
Oh, that's very nice.
And Dick Sutholter will be up, and a whole bunch of people.
Oh, Dick, give them all my best. And would you give them give Dick my telephone number, would you?
Yes, I will.
All right. Take good care.
But thanks again.
Not at all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.